Closing costs in a real estate transaction. What are they? And should you ask the other party to pay for it? We're going to talk about that up next. Hey, what's going on, friends? Dylan Nolaka here with the Buy Big Island video blog, and today we're going to talk about closing costs. So a lot of times a buyer or a seller will say, well, make the other guy pay for closing costs, and that is sometimes a very ambiguous, or it is a very ambiguous and vague request, because depending on who you ask, closing costs can mean different things. So to a escrow officer, closing costs could be their fees and title insurance. To a mortgage broker, closing costs could be the points and the lender fees that they have that are required to close a loan. To a real estate agent, closing costs are commissions. That's part of the cost to close a transaction. So all of those things added up really translate into a buyer or a seller's total closing costs. But some of it is addressed in a contract and some of it is not. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through the contracted closing costs and then talk about a couple of things that are not in the contract, so you can consider what is reasonable to pay for, what is not, and if you want to make such a request, if it makes sense in the deal that you're doing and in that negotiation, if injecting and adding closing costs in as a negotiating factor is something that you want to do. So to go through what is actually contracted in the Hawaii purchase contract as closing costs, I'm just going to run through these real quick and we can talk about them specifically, and some of them we've covered in past videos in terms of what they are and what their costs are. But to the buyer side, so the buyer is going to pay 40% of the premium for standard title insurance. So 40% is paid by the buyer and 60% is paid by the seller for title insurance. The buyer also pays the cost of drafting the mortgage. The buyer pays the cost of obtaining buyer's consents. The buyer pays the cost of a notary if they need to get a mobile notary to sign their documents somewhere else. They're going to pay for all recording fees except the documents the seller has to record in order to clear the title. They're going to pay 50% of the escrow fee, so the cost that the escrow company pays to process their transaction, they pay half of that. Any condominium or homeowner association transfer fees will be paid for by the buyer, and then any FHA, VA, points or mortgage fees that are required by the buyer's lender will be paid for by the buyer. So there's a lot of things there. Some of it applies to some transactions, some of it doesn't, but those are things that are going to be paid for by the buyer. On the seller side, like we talked about, they pay 60% of the cost of the title insurance. They pay for the cost of drafting the conveyance documents and the bill of sale if they're using that. They pay for the cost of obtaining the seller's consents. They pay for 50% of the cost of the escrow fees, right? That's split. They pay for the seller notary fees. So if you got to hire a notary to come to your house or your office to sign documents, you pay for the cost of that notary fee. They pay for the cost of staking and survey, right? So if that's required in the contract, that's a closing cost that they're going to have to pay for. They pay for the recording fees to clear the seller's title. They pay for any FHA or VA mandatory closing costs that may be required to be paid for by the seller. They're going to pay for conveyance tax, which is in the contract, as whether it's different based upon whether or not the buyer is buying it as a principal residence or not. And then they're going to pay FIRPTA or HARPTA if they're not a Hawaii state resident, and that's a huge cost potentially to a seller, and that's something that they have to be aware of, because that will come out of the seller's proceeds when you close. And so those are the contracted costs as closing costs, but there are also other costs that are addressed in the contract or potentially added to the contract. So another one is termite inspection and treatment if that's necessary. That's going to be paid for by the seller unless otherwise negotiated in the contract. They're going to pay for commissions, right? The real estate commissions are a very big part of the closing cost expense, and that's going to be paid for by the seller. And then any type of assessments or SSPP is one of the things that we have here on a Big Island, where you have subdivisions where electric was brought in but wasn't paid for by the homeowners at the time. So there's a assessment that has to be paid to hook up electric to a lot, and that a lot of times a buyer will require a seller to pay off prior to taking ownership. That could be negotiated in a contract too, but there's those and potentially other things that could be negotiated as costs to close a transaction. So they're all things that you want to take into account and think about in terms of what you're willing to pay for. So when a buyer or a seller says, I want the buyer to pay all the closing costs, what does that mean? Does it mean you want to pay all of that stuff plus the commissions, plus some of these other staking, survey, termite, all of those things? You have to be very specific when you say, I want the other party to pay for closing costs, because it can mean different things to different people. And so there are some situations where it makes sense to make that request. And not all situations it does make sense to ask the other party to pay for closing costs. But in some situations where if it's a VA loan or a loan program where it's a very low or no down payment loan, the buyer may not have any money to come out of pocket. The buyer's closing costs in general are very small compared to the seller's closing costs, but maybe they can't come up with the $1,500 or $2,000 in additional cash that they need to close. And to get the deal done and under contract, the seller may cover those costs as part of the contract to help the buyer out. Because if they're doing a VA loan and they're not putting any money down, or they don't have a lot of cash to come out of pocket, the seller can cover their escrow and title fees to help assist in getting the transaction closed. Another common place where we're not really in the market right now, but when there's a competitive seller market and buyers want to make, or it's a very competitive seller's market and the buyers want to make their offer stronger, they can offer to pay for some of the seller's closing costs to put them in a better position if there are multiple offers and they have to beat other offers in order to get their offer accepted. A buyer may do that, as offer to pay some of the seller's closing costs or a fixed amount towards the seller's closing costs. You can put that in a contract. We'll pay $3,000 of the seller's closing costs to help strengthen their offer. And then in a strong buyer's market where the seller wants to make the best deal possible for the buyer. So if there's it's a down market and it's really hard for sellers to sell, they may offer as a concession some money towards the buyer's closing costs or cover some of the buyer's closing costs in order to sweeten the deal for the buyer and get them to choose that house over another house if it's a strong buyer's market. So there are situations where it makes sense. In the market right now that we're in, there isn't a lot of that going on. We're in a pretty stable market, so we're not seeing a lot of closing costs get transferred one way or the other, but it does happen from time to time. It's something to talk to your agent about to see if it makes sense and get the best deal possible for yourself. But it's all, it changes from time to time, and if you have any questions, always here to help out and answer those questions. So if you got any comments, put them in the comments below. Please like the YouTube channel and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next week. Aloha.